To start out my story quilt, first I am going to create a sketch of how I want my story quilt square to look. First, I am creating my border using a ruler. You do not have to use a ruler. Your border could be wavy, it could be made up of multiple pieces, it can be anything you want it to be. The next step is I'm going to use the trace transfer technique to put some elements into my quilt I would like to look a certain way. First, I printed out a hand that is going to be reaching for some paintbrushes. I am going to use a piece of graphite to create a way for it to transfer onto my paper. I am going to place it where I would like it and trace over it. In my story for my quilt square, I am thinking about how I am reaching out for art in my life, that I needed to be able to have a grasp on that art to feel whole in myself. After I have my quilt square drawn, I am going to use different pieces to create patterns to cut out of pieces of cloth. I am just using the actual square on this piece. Next, I am going to use tracing paper to trace over some of the more complicated items on my quilting square. I am going to use these so I can transfer the shapes onto other pieces of cloth. I am going to use different scraps of cloth that I have collected over the years. These particular cloth pieces are from my grandmother. My grandmother is the one who taught me the joy of art and how it is important to me in my life. In traditional story quilts, every scrap was used. This was because of the scarcity of materials, but also so they did not waste anything. As I am cutting out my pieces, I want you guys to think about how many of you have relatives that have created quilts. I bet if you come from Amish heritage, most of your relatives have created a quilt at some point. It is very common to have quilting bees, where many women come together and create a quilt together. I am going to use water-based oil pastels from the background of my quilt square. You could use watercolor paints, thin down acrylic paints, or even charcoal pencils to create your background. I am now going to start putting my quilting square together using the sewing machine. The first thing I am going to do is I'm going to work from the background forward. I will first put on the border of my quilting square. I am going to carefully pin it down and use the sewing machine to connect the pieces. Once I have used the sewing machine to connect my less complicated pieces, I am now going to use the embroidery needle and embroidery floss to create details around the more detailed pieces. can also use things like glue or stitch witchery to connect down pieces on your quilting square. You could use the embroidery floss, or you could even paint stitches on to make the item look quilted. Now it is time to create your story quilt. What will your story be about? What is something you feel strongly about? What is a wonderful tradition that runs in your family?